Welcome, everybody. I guess maybe, Gary, we can start with a quick introduction. For those that don't know me, I'm Toby Story. I'm the now owner of Southern Sea Ventures. And yeah, I get to guide on a lot of these trips. And I'm just excited to be here to talk a little bit about what we're doing in the Arctic. And of course, very happy to have Gary here with us, who is a font of great wisdom and much knowledge. So, Gary, do you want to? I'll let you do a quick intro.
Oh yeah, well I've been guiding for a long time in the Arctic. I started working with polar bears in the Arctic back in the late 1970s, but in terms of tourism and visiting Svalbard and Greenland, it's been about 23 years now, and I've known Toby for about 10 of that, and working together also in the Arctic and both poles actually with the Antarctic as well. I have another hat that I did quite a bit of research on penguins in the Antarctic, and some research on polar bears in the Arctic. So I'm a scientist, but now I'm pretty much retired from that part, and I just do tours and guiding. So hopefully we'll have a full ship next June and August for these trips. But yeah, I intend to be there, and so I'll be giving you a little bit of presentation about a bit of the wildlife.
Fantastic. Well, I might just go straight into it. So I'm going to share my screen, and yeah, we'll get straight into the presentation. So, Gary, if you could just confirm that you can.
Yep, I can see. Do you see me on the side?
Yes. Yeah.
Because I can just stick my hand up when. Okay.
As and when.
Yep.
Okie dokie. I'll just. Okay, well, I think we've already done our quick welcome and introduction. Obviously, we're just talking about our trips to the Arctic next year. We also have trips to the Antarctic coming up very soon, and we'll be releasing our 2025 dates soon as well. But tonight, we just want to go through talk a little bit about the trips that we're doing, and more importantly, probably just a bit about the environment that we're visiting as well, because it's a pretty special part of the world. And here we go. But just before we get started, I just wanted a quick nod to Southern Sea Ventures and the previous owner, Al Baker, who set the company up in 1988 and first started with tours in Fiji in the tropics, so a long way from the polar regions, but quickly migrated to running trips in the polar regions. And Al was the first operator to set up and run kayaking in Antarctica, and also one of the second to set up in Svalbard as well. So he's very much an early adopter, and has had a real passion for exploration and exploring the world's wild places. And I was very fortunate to be involved for about 17 years now, and it's how I got to go meet Gary, and also how I got to get to a lot of these places. And I took over the business in March 2020. Yeah, anyway, there's a good pun in there about great time to take over an international travel business. But of course, it's meant that we've had the opportunity to focus in Tasmania and also more widely back into the polar regions, which is sort of part of what we've done for a long time. So lovely to be back out there. And of course, we were originally a kayaking company exclusively, and now we do sea kayaking as a large portion of what we do, but we also have a very broad program on board the Polar Pioneer, as you'll see. So just going to go through the three different trips that we're offering. So we've got 3 dates, one in Svalbard in the early season, and then the Svalbard to Greenland, so crossing the Greenland Sea over to East Greenland, and then an exclusively East Greenland trip in late August, early September. And we'll go into more detail about each one of those in due course. But of course, this is Norway here, and this is a cut-out section of Svalbard, which is to the north of Norway. So this is where our trips are in June, and then we're crossing over from Svalbard, across the Greenland Sea, down the east coast of Greenland to Iceland for our second trip. And for our last trip for the season, we'll be out of Iceland from Oct23 here in the north, up to the east coast of Greenland and back down here again. So I might flick across and I'll let Gary go ahead with just talking about the environment there, and then we can go back into some of the more detail about the trips after that. So, Gary, I'll leave it with you.
Well, welcome to the Arctic. So you can see here by this image, it's quite spectacular. Hang on, my dog is barking. Let me shut the door.
Nothing quite like working from home these days.
Yes. Anyway, what I want to do most of all is talk a bit about the wildlife, because that's my expertise. But I do want to give obviously a nodding acknowledgement to the spectacular scenery that's there. So ice and mountains and everything else. But go ahead, Toby, next. And Toby showed the one map. This is a map, a bit closer map of the Svalbard area. The main island, the big island there is Spitsbergen. And what I've got circled is because in the early part of the season in June, ice is around to the north and the east a lot. And our sort of theater of operations is going to be more or less where that circle is, potentially also going a bit to the south along that west coast there. But regardless of sort of the ice limiting us, the ice also gives us opportunities, because there's plenty of nooks and crannies to go to spend the whole 10 days looking around for various wildlife, and spectacular areas for paddling as well. Go ahead. So obviously going up to the Arctic, the polar bear is kind of the #1 thing that everybody wants to see, and Svalbard is one of the best places in the world to see them. And the ice in the early season is spectacular for that, because you potentially get to see them like this, which is the best way. They look most polar when they're standing on sea ice and roaming and such on sea ice. And so we have the opportunity. Now it's all wildlife. And so the individuals like polar bears, there's around 3,000 polar bears in Svalbard, and they're roaming around and out on the ice as well. But it's a little bit, of course, hit or miss as to when you get to see them and in what conditions you get to see them. But we almost always have at least 1 or 2 excellent observations. You can see from these pictures, you might be able to see in the upper right there, the one out on the sea ice walking along, and one with cubs in the lower right. And then 2 together, they're actually feeding on a carcass in the upper left. And then the one on the lower left, he's actually standing on the carcass of a whale. So if there's some sort of feature like that around, that'll be a sure bet to find some polar bears around in those places. If you're really, really lucky, this happens. Apparently, it's happening more now because of the early ice melting away from the fjords, and so the bears are coming ashore more. But here we are confronting walrus. Now, walrus is it is the largest pinniped in the northern hemisphere, and so they're not particularly afraid of bears. You can see they're standing their ground, and in the end, the bear didn't attack anybody in this case. But they're pretty spectacular, and they come out to these haul-outs. Next day. And we can almost guarantee that we'll see walrus somewhere on the trip, because the haul-outs where they come ashore on the sand, and as you can see in the lower right there, they're a group of them all in a wallow, all laying together and stuff. Those are in traditional places, and we know about them, and so we can schedule to go to them. To see an individual like the one in the upper right is a little bit hit or miss, and the ones on the ice, if we get up to the north, it's particularly fun to see them out on the ice and in the water. As paddlers, Toby knows that you get out of the water or you get away from them, because they're potentially dangerous to paddlers and to zodiacs, in fact. There's a range of other seals. On the upper left, that's a ring seal, and below that is a harbor seal. And the 2 on the far right are both of bearded seals, and they're the most common other seals that we see besides the walruses. And those are much more sparse, and they don't have traditional haul outs, but we see them up on ice. And as paddlers, it's excellent because you're quiet and you don't make as much disturbance as you approach them, and so they're actually a bit more relaxed around paddlers than they are around zodiacs, which are bigger and noisy and that sort of thing. So aside from the things in water, we have, of course, animals on land as well. And the reindeer actually is a subspecies that's unique to Svalbard. It's shorter legged, so it's shorter of stature compared to other reindeer in the world. It's the same species. There's about 7 subspecies around the Arctic in various places, a few in Canada, and then, of course, in Norway and across Siberia and such. But this is another individual that when we get ashore, we'll most certainly be able to find some somewhere. It's one of the wildlife animals that we see regularly. And you can see from this image, we see them fairly close up. They're not particularly worried about people. In the June trip in Svalbard, they're more likely to look like the ones on top. You can see they're still in their winter coat, and their antlers have not grown back very much. Some of them have some antler growth, but they haven't grown back very far. The males have already started to grow, and the females haven't yet, and they've lost theirs. And they have this very white coat that's their winter heavier coat, and we'll see them in the molting process a little bit later. And in fact, in the June trip, it's probably they'll be getting towards looking like the ones at the bottom where they have their summer coats. And they have a tremendous change of weight over the summertime. They need to eat because the winter is tough on them. And they weigh, the males weigh something around 90 kilos, and they vary 20 kilos from summer to winter because of the difficulties in the wintertime. Another species that we see regularly, but also it's sometimes it requires a lot of searching and spotting around particular areas. And we do know areas where there are fox families and such, is the Arctic fox. They're lovely. They often are curious. They're not particularly bothered by people. They don't like to come in very close. Some other places in the Arctic where they interact with people a lot, they'll actually come right up to you and such because they get fed and they find food with people. But Svalbard does a good job of maintaining its distance from wildlife, so we don't feed any wildlife, we don't touch wildlife, we don't try to approach too closely. But they're not particularly worried about us. Again, they are the one in the top right, you can see is kind of a ragged looking thing, and it has a white coat. These are Arctic fox, so in the wintertime they're pure white. And for a very long time in Svalbard, the trapping industry was a big deal in Svalbard up until the late 20th century. And the white coats of the Arctic fox in the wintertime were the prize ones. And in fact, trappers could get more for a fox pelt than they could for a polar bear pelt, sort of thing. And in the summertime, they had this sort of two-tone look to them normally, and they're rushing around. They're quite small foxes, but they rush around on the shorelines and looking for, the one on the lower left has found himself a guillemot, and so they stash and cache, I should say, food for holding them over the winter time. And so even in the middle of summer, they eat some and cache others and stuff, so they try to prepare for the summer. So foxes are always an exciting spotting while we're going. There's a variety of whales. The blue whale is probably the most exciting individual species of whale that we likely to see. Fin whales are quite common. We do sometimes see humpback whales. I don't have an image of one here, but probably the most commonly seen one is the beluga, the one in the white whales. And they don't have a dorsal fin, and so they don't show very much at the surface, but we're always keeping an eye out, and most trips we spot some. In the case of Svalbard, it's not a tremendous migration spot. like some spots in the Antarctic are, for example. So they're not in huge numbers, but in most years there are blue whales around, and in most years we see fin whales and beluga as well. Another huge feature up there are the birds, and this is just a small selection of them. The guillemots and their relatives are the most numerous. There's one called the little auk, which I don't have a picture here, that in the Barents Sea, where Svalbard is located, there's over 20 million pairs. So we're talking about huge numbers of seabirds in some cases. Everyone loves to see puffins, but Svalbard is not a particularly huge place for puffins. There's a few places where they nest, but they're not numerous. If you specifically want to see puffins, go to Norway or Scotland or perhaps Iceland at the right time of year. But we do see them, and it's always a favorite of people. And the kittiwakes is probably the most common ones, and they're a gull, a small gull. They're probably just a tiny bit smaller than the silver gulls that we have in Australia, and they nest on cliff sides, but they're also found in quite big flocks, and we often see them if we're traveling around a glacier, the face of a glacier, or out where there's a lot of sea ice and such. We see big flocks of them at times. And the ivory gull, which I have pictured here, is one that people who are interested in birds, like bird watchers, are particularly excited about, because it never comes farther south than about Svalbard. And so you have to go to the high Arctic in order to see ivory gulls. Even in the wintertime, they stay in the very far north. And they're a beautiful gull because they're all white, with this sort of a gray and flesh-colored bill. And the other interesting thing about them is they are often found adjacent to polar bear kills, because they like to eat a little meat in their diet, and they are scavengers around polar bears. And almost invariably, if you find a bear feeding on something, there'll be some ivory gulls hanging out with him. Yeah. There are other species around. The terns are very common and well liked. They're elegant and of course diving for their food. We see them all the time. And the eiders are around. We have king eider and also common eider in Svalbard, and they are particularly prevalent in the early season. We see them all the time. They come up very early in order to nest as soon as the snow goes away from the landscape, and as a consequence, they are already staging to leave by the end of July and such. And so we see them a little less as the summer goes on. And the Svalbard ptarmigan is another unique subspecies. It's related to the rock ptarmigan found in North America, but it's one of the very few land birds. There's really only 2 species of land bird, and it's the only species that stays in Svalbard all winter long. So I mentioned the landscapes. This is an ice-scape, and I managed to get the splash of a giant calving off of this glacier face. This is pretty exciting stuff in a kayak. It's pretty exciting in a Zodiac as well. So if you're not kayaking, and of course you can choose not to, we do spend at least some of our outings not focusing on trying to find wildlife per se, but just being in the environment and enjoying these places where the glaciers come down into the sea, and there's calvings and there's lots of sea ice around. Of course, those are places where we have a high likelihood of finding seals, and also the beluga whales and that sort of thing around glacier faces. But it's also exciting and very scenic for us to travel at that. So it's not always wildlife. And not only that, but throughout the summer, there's a tremendous diversity of wildflowers. Now, I say tremendous diversity. As you go north, there's not as many species, but there's always something blooming, because in the northern hemisphere, the south-facing slopes melt the snow off first, and they get a bit warmer. So the south-facing slopes, the plants bloom early. And as you get into different aspects of slopes, they bloom later. And so it sort of doesn't matter when you go. We found last year, the trip started in May instead of into June. We're about 10 days later this year, which will be good for the flowers, because last year the snow was literally just disappearing from so many of the landscapes that not many of the blooms were out yet. The moss campion, there are almost always a few of them flowering, and some of the early flowers as well. But in Greenland, it's also much more lush vegetation. So the later season stuff, and when you get into September, you start getting into autumn colors, which is lovely with the way the plants change colors. Just to get a bit more close up, you can see the black line there is kind of the Svalbard to Iceland trip. And we follow along. Even at that stage, we'll probably run into some ice along the northern part of the East Greenland coast, where we are coming in close to the coast. And traditionally, we haven't had very good luck with polar bears on the Greenland coast. We've always seen one or two, but our last trip, just 2 months ago, was ridiculous. We saw nine different polar bears, and some of which were in really good observations up very close. And so I think some of the changes with the way the ice conditions are probably make the polar bears a bit more observable in East Greenland nowadays. And we go into these deep fjord systems and then finish up going to Iceland. And the last trip, of course, starts in Iceland and finishes in Iceland, but we still go right up to the fjord areas on the east coast there. Yeah, go ahead. In Greenland, we have muskox, which we do not have in Svalbard. Now, in East Greenland, there's also no reindeer. There's plenty of reindeer in Greenland, but they're all on the west side. And so the wildlife does change a bit, and it has a bit of a different look. The landscapes do, and the vegetation, as I say, is a bit more lush. So in Svalbard, you're doing well to get vegetation that's this tall, sort of thing. And in Greenland, it might get up to your knees when we go into some of the really great stuff into the bush in Greenland. But we see muskox regularly and frequently at a distance, and every now and then we get lucky and we get to see them up fairly close, like this. This a cow with a calf. The calf's facing away. Go on to the next. There's another group of wildlife there that's not in Svalbard. So there's Arctic hare, which are fun. If we manage to see some, they're often in small groups. In some places in the Arctic, they get into quite large groups. And if they get startled, they hop away like kangaroos on their hind feet only. Then they go bounding off like kangaroos do. And if we're very lucky, we might see one of these little weasels, the long-tailed weasel there. And of course, they prey on lemmings, which are in Greenland and not found in Svalbard. But they also prey on young Arctic hare as well. They're probably not big enough to take a full adult Arctic hare. They're quite big hares. In fact, they equal the foxes in weight. And so foxes even have a bit of a hard time with an adult hare. But the young ones that are, young and stupid, so to speak, are fairly easy for the foxes. So there is wildlife in Greenland. One thing about Greenland is that the wildlife is a bit more shy. In the area where about half of the trip is likely to take place in Scoresbysund, there's a small native village there called Oct23, and they're hunters. And the historical native people from there were hunters. And so in Greenland, the animals have all been hunted, so they're a bit shy of people. But in Svalbard, never really hunting except for the trapping of foxes and the hunting of polar bears. And that ended literally 2 or 3 generations ago for the animals. And so they've all forgotten that. And so the animals are quite more tolerant of us. So that's kind of a rundown, a very brief rundown of the wildlife. And this is one of the bears we spotted on the last Southern Sea Ventures trip to Svalbard. And he just waved away to us. So see you next year in the Arctic. happy to answer any questions. I'll turn it back over to Toby. He's got a few more things to say before we just hand it open to questions.
Yeah, sure. I might just keep rolling, Gary. Thank you. That was great. And yeah, he was a very fabulous bear, wasn't he? That one.
Yeah, yeah.
Just for a brief interlude, we thought we'd just play a little video, which is all footage that we collected from our trip in Svalbard this year. So I'll just go straight into that, and then I'll talk a little bit more about some of the logistics of the trips themselves. Well, that was enjoyable to relive.
Yeah,
Beautiful one
fantastic.
day, perfect the next. And that was actually, it wasn't just for the camera, that was true. It was exactly like that the whole way through the trip. So certainly not always like that, but it's more frequently than you'd expect. You have really good conditions up in the Arctic, especially in Svalbard and Greenland. And you've always got fjords to hide in as well, where you can escape the weather if and when you do have some. Oops, sorry, I'll just flick on through here. So I just sort of wanted to talk a little bit about the nature of the trips. Gary's touched on quite a lot of it, but just to sort of expand a little bit on that, in terms of what we're sort of doing on a daily basis, we're always responsive to the weather. We're always responsive to the ice conditions, the wildlife opportunities, and the sort of enthusiasm on board for certain activities or information. But there is a bit of a routine. So we're doing 2 outings per day once we begin operations, and that just to give a bit of a routine. We basically breakfast, and then after breakfast we'll head out for a landing and or cruise or kayak, back on board for lunch, and then out again in the afternoon. Occasionally we might do something before breakfast or after dinner if there's something of particular interest in an area. So if we have photographers on board or kayakers who are particularly keen to get out for an extra paddle, or just to see an aurora perhaps. But just in terms of the activities that are included, we always offer hikes. So wherever we go, where hiking is available, we'll try to offer hikes mixed with sort of short hikes to medium length hikes to shore-based ambles for people who are more interested in exploring the history or flora fauna of the particular area. Lectures, obviously, on board. You get Gary's services and a range of other people who are there, who are experts in their various fields. Zodiac cruising, of course, for glacier cruising and wildlife spotting, and ship cruising, of course, is part of the experience, being on board the vessel and moving from place to place. So this image you can see up here, passing through the pack ice just north of Svalbard, pointing towards the North Pole, is actually a really enjoyable part of the experience, being on board. And you can see everyone hanging out the front here, enjoying the sun and just traveling from place to place. So there's sort of a never-ending stream of things to do. And then for those that want a little extra, the kayaking is an activity that you can sign up for. And on select voyages, we also have a photographic package, which gives you sort of tuition before the voyage or preparation sessions and follow-up sessions, as well as guidance and tuition throughout the voyage, and a dedicated Zodiac for doing photography. As we often find that photographers are quite happy circling an iceberg for an hour, whereas others may want to move around a little bit more. So we've sort of split that out to make sure the photographers and everyone else is also very happy. And you get sort of a lot of attention from one of our photographic experts on board. And I'll just flick through. So Svalbard, this I guess was our first trip was this year. These photos are not all from this trip, but this one here is one of my personal favorites. Just paddling north. We're up in the pack ice, paddling up towards the North Pole, amongst the sea ice there, and it's something quite magic being that far north in amongst the ice, with nothing between you and the North Pole but ice and open water. And this guy here was my first ever polar bear, and I'm pretty sure Gary would have been on the ship, and we were cruising around Svalbard and turned up in a little fjord area, and there was a bear somewhere way out in the distance, but the chefs were busy preparing lunch, and as the vessel pulled up to the ice, this bear sort of slowly came tromping across the ice towards us, and it was very curious, wandering around just right in front of the ship. And of course, I'm a kayaker, most definitely, but I also really do enjoy getting on land. And there's really wonderful hikes to do on shore as well. And you can see the landscape here at the early season in Svalbard, which is almost completely covered in snow, and it just brings it alive, makes it sort of somewhat more magical at that early part of the year to be surrounded by snow and ice. So obviously the trip's 11 days in length, and we embark and disembark in Longyearbyen, and we've got both kayaking and photography available on that voyage. The next trip that we're running in the Arctic will be crossing over from Svalbard across to Greenland, so in the late summer. But obviously the height of probably the least ice extent, so we get the most opportunities to get right up into the fjord systems. You get the opportunity to experience both Svalbard and the east coast of Greenland, so the land of kayaking and the land of polar bears, although we had pretty exceptional kayaking in Svalbard this year and pretty exceptional bears in Greenland, so they're both pretty special from that perspective. From a personal standpoint, I think one of the most incredible things that I have seen on one of these voyages was a blue whale and its calf, and that was on the crossing from Svalbard across to Greenland. We had been steaming for about a day. It was beautiful weather, very calm seas, and it's often quite calm on that particular crossing. And we'd sort of seen a bit of sea ice, so we come up along the sea ice edge, and I just ducked down into my room to edit some photos. And again, Gary was there, so Gary came running past. Toby, get outside, there's a blue whale. So we ran outside, and there was just a blue whale and a calf moving along the sea ice edge here just as the sun was going down. So that was my first opportunity to see a blue whale, and it was in a pretty special place as well. So this trip's a little longer. It's 14 days in length. We embark in Longyearbyen and disembark in Oct23. And we have kayaking available on that voyage, of course. Now, Greenland, East Greenland's, not sure what's captivated me so much about East Greenland. I think it's probably the landscape, but it is a really special place. The diversity of opportunities of experience up there, particularly at that time of year. I've got a real interest in Inuit history and early cultures, and the interaction that they have with the landscape. And it's really quite amazing to see. We've got the opportunity to visit the village, which is incredibly a really remote community, and sort of see contemporary Inuit life in a remote part of the world. There's also really fabulous hiking opportunities in Greenland. Again, as I said, I'm a kayaker, but I do like to get out of my kayak and go for a walk in Greenland. Just the landscape is very open, and the geology is really special. So it makes the hiking really, really fantastic. The icebergs have a really special character there as well, and especially when juxtaposed with the rocks, which I'll show you a little bit more of in just the next slide, because I really think they are something special and something very unique, not something I've seen in any other parts of the world. And of course, we're in the late season, so 26th of August to 6th of September. So we're just starting to get a little bit of darkness, and that gives us the opportunity to spot aurora. Obviously not a guarantee, but we did have auroras on the last voyage that we did, and on every other voyage that I've done at that late time of year when we've had darkness. That's a 12-day trip, so in and out of, oops, sorry, I'll just quickly, excuse me, 12-day trip in and out of Oct23 in the north of Iceland, and we obviously have kayaking on that voyage as well. So just to reiterate where Oct23 is, northern Iceland here. So the voyage will take us across the Denmark Strait and over to the east of Greenland, this area here. We typically will make landfall after one night at sea and an afternoon in this area, Roma Fjord, and then we'll be exploring Scoresby and the fjord systems to the north of there, depending on the opportunities that we have, wildlife, weather, sea ice, and ocean currents and waves, etc., ocean conditions. I really just wanted to throw in, I mean, we're going to a land of ice and Arctic wildlife, but also the rock formations in East Greenland are all really, really special. And these are three of my sort of personal favorite locations. So this top one here is in an area called the Bear Islands, and it's a place that we get to paddle through, or Zodiac cruise through. I mean, you could spend a week there just about in the islands themselves, but it's a really wonderful place to be able to traverse through and explore, and this incredible features throughout there. This one here is an area, Red Fjord, and the juxtaposition of these beautiful icebergs against the red rocks is really something quite special. This one here we call Snassersfellen Point, which most of us can't pronounce, so we call it Gatto Point, which is Cake Point, and that's because of this layering in the rocks here, which looks like a layered cake. And the colours probably in this photo barely do it justice. I mean, it really is that vibrant on most days. And again, just a beautiful geological feature, and somewhere that I really love to visit when we get to East Greenland. All of the voyages that we're doing are on the ship, the Polar Pioneer. We choose this ship because of her size and capacity, primarily. So fantastic forward bow here area for people to get out the front and enjoy the scenery, enjoy the passing of time through the fjords. She's a very strong ice strengthened vessel. She's got two engines, which makes her very powerful as well. So she's got a strong hull, but also she's a very powerful ship for her size, which enables her to really push through some pretty heavy ice when needed. So very sturdy, very reliable, and has only 50 passengers on board, which is quite unique in the kind of cruising and expedition cruising world, because many ships are either very small, sort of 12 passengers, or very large, sort of 180 passengers. So there's not many ships that fit into that category. and that we feel gives us the best kind of combination of capability and intimacy in the trip. Also just means we're a bit faster to load and unload, so when we're going ashore we can maximize our time off the vessel, which is something we really like to do. It's a upcycled ship, as they like to say, so it's just been recently refurbished, which means new engines, overhauled engines, not brand new, but a lot of new electrical works, navigation equipment, and sauna and bar, very importantly, a new lecture area. So it's comfortable and cozy. Certainly it's not a luxury vessel, but it provides all the comfort and capability that a vessel of that kind requires. So we sort of like to, who's the trip suitable for? It's really open to all levels of experience. It's mostly, we're very much focused on getting people outside and spending time outside, being active, experiencing the natural world as much as possible, searching for wildlife opportunities, and of course providing great kayaking and hiking opportunities as well. As we say, age is no barrier. We have people as young as 8 and older than 80 on our voyages, and we really just embrace spirit of adventure, and those that like to have a flexible and full itinerary, and active and informed experience in the polar regions. So just a quick summary. We've got our first trip in Svalbard, 7th to the 17th of June, and then in August, the 4th to the 17th, we'll be traveling from Svalbard across to Greenland. And then finally, the 26th of August to the 6th of September, we'll have our Greenland only voyage. So that'll be onto the east coast of Greenland. And I will just mention while you're here that we are running an early bird special for all of our Arctic trips up until the end of November. So over the next month, which means you can get 20% off your next trip if you book before the end of November. So I'll just mention that, and then I'll move across to questions. If anyone